The following message is a presentation of Legonier Ministries, home of the radio program Renewing Your Mind with R.C. Sproul.
Today we come to the conclusion of our recent study of the new document that has been released concerning the essence of the gospel, which is an evangelical celebration. And we've been looking carefully at the second part of that document, the list of articles of affirmation and denial. And of course, there are 18 such articles incorporated in this document. And today we come to the final article, article number 18, which reads as follows. We affirm that Jesus Christ commands his followers to proclaim the gospel to all living persons, evangelizing everyone, everywhere, and discipling believers within the fellowship of the church. A full and faithful witness to Christ includes the witness of personal testimony, godly living, and acts of mercy and charity to our neighbor, without which the preaching of the gospel appears barren. We deny that the witness of personal testimony, godly living, and acts of mercy and charities to our neighbors constitute evangelism apart from the proclamation of the gospel. Now, this is somewhat lengthy in the concluding article, and what the document is getting at here is a strong reaffirmation of the Great Commission. And what is called the Great Commission is Christ's mandate to his disciples and to his church that he gave just prior to his ascension when he commanded his disciples to go into all the world and to preach the gospel to every living creature, to make disciples from all tribes and peoples and tongues and nations. And that has defined the missionary task of the church since the first century. I recently had a discussion, it really wasn't that recent now that I think about it, with a missionary that had been laboring in a remote part of the world, ministering to a group of people who had never seen a white person before, and they were primitive in their culture and so on, and had no contact with the outside world. And this person labored with this tribe for several years, and when they finally came to an understanding of the gospel, many were converted to Christ, including the chief of the village. And on one occasion, the chief asked the missionary how long ago Jesus lived on the earth. And the woman tried to find a way to communicate in the language of the people the vast distance of time of 2,000 years, and there was no way that she could make that communication possible until, they talked about so many moons and so many generations and so on. And so finally, the chief took some sticks and he let each stick represent a generation. And he asked the question, he said, "Did Jesus live during my generation?" And the missionary said, "No." And so then he put a second stick and he said, "Well, did he live during my father's life?" "No." And then a third stick, "My grandfather's life?" "No." And with each stick that he put on the ground, his countenance grew more and more distressed, until after he had this vast length of sticks on the ground, stretching all the way back to the first century, he was beside himself, and he said to her, "Well, if Jesus lived so long ago, why is it that we are only hearing about him now?" Well, of course, the only answer we can give to a question like that is that we have not been as faithful as we ought to be to the Great Commission of Christ. In fact, there remain many, many people on the globe today who have never heard the name of Christ. In fact, today, a record is being set in the world. There are more people dying today, on this day in human history, without ever having heard the gospel of Christ than on any day in past history. And the record that is being set today is breaking the record that was set yesterday. And today's record will be broken tomorrow. Because we are at a point now in history where the population expansion of the world is moving at a more rapid pace than is the pace of the church's outreach in missionary activity to preach the gospel to every living creature. And perhaps there's no generation with less of an excuse to fulfill the Great Commission than ours, because the world has become so much smaller than it ever was in the past, with our ability to travel with the modern conveniences and conveyances that we have. But again, the first affirmation is a reminder that Christ commands his followers to proclaim the gospel to all living persons, evangelizing everyone, everywhere. Now, there is a reaction in our day against the whole enterprise of evangelism, as it's understood as being proselytizing, and that people ought to mind their own business and not try to influence other people to leave whatever religion they're in at the time to embrace Christ. In fact, in many churches in our day that are engaged in evangelism here in the United States, it's tacitly assumed that certain people or certain groups, either ethnic groups or religious groups, are out of bounds for evangelism, because if you begin an outreach to Muslims or to Buddhists in the neighborhood or to the Jewish community in the neighborhood, you expose yourself to much hostility, as evangelism inevitably involves a conflict of ideas, which conflict of ideas can sometimes escalate into more serious kinds, if there is such a thing as more serious kind of conflict than that. And so many of us are very passive or very restrictive in the outreach of our churches and don't fulfill the mandate to preach the gospel to all people everywhere. Not only do we fail it at the international level, but we fail to fulfill the Great Commission even at the local level where we live. And it says the command is to proclaim the gospel to all living persons, evangelizing everyone everywhere, and discipling believers within the fellowship of the church. Now that's there for a reason. That the mandate of the Great Commission is not merely to proclaim, but it is also to educate or to disciple. In Jesus' commission, he said, preach the gospel and make disciples. A disciple is a learner in biblical terms. And a disciple is a student. And that means that after people respond to the gospel, they are to be engaged in more than enjoying the fellowship of the church or even the worship of the church, but they're also called to be deeply involved in the educational exercise and operation of the church. Because the church exists not only to proclaim, but also to ground the converts to Christ in a deep understanding of the things of God. In the early church, the distinction was between didache, which is the educational catechetical instruction, as distinguished from the kerygma, which was the proclamation. The early church saw evangelism, and those who responded to the evangelism were then brought into the fold of the church, and that began their nurture and discipling as students and followers of Christ. Now it goes on to say, a full and faithful witness to Christ includes the witness of personal testimony, godly living, and acts of mercy and charity to our neighbor, without which the preaching of the gospel appears barren. Now let me say first about this, that this section of Article 18 speaks about different ways to bear witness to Christ. Now, I've said before in other programs, and I'll say it now again in this context, in the New Testament there is a difference or a distinction between evangelism and witnessing. And I say that for this reason, that in the contemporary popular jargon of Christians, Christians tend to use the term to witness as a synonym for the verb to evangelize, as if the words were interchangeable. Now, to bear witness to Christ is to call attention to Him in many different ways. We do it by the example that we seek to set with godly living. We seek to bear witness or to make manifest the presence of Christ through deeds and acts of mercy, by feeding the hungry and giving shelter to the homeless, and all of these charitable endeavors. Those are all kinds of witnessing, but they are not evangelism. Evangelism is one form of witnessing. So that all evangelism does bear witness to Christ. So all evangelism is witnessing. But not all witnessing is evangelism. There are many ways that we bear witness to the Lordship of Christ. One of which, and we may even say the chief of which, is the proclamation of the gospel. But why do we say this? It's important because many people say, well, I do my evangelism by my example. I don't ever proclaim Christ with words. I proclaim Christ with my life. Now, what can your life tell people about the content of the gospel? They can look at you from now until kingdom come and still know nothing of the atonement of Christ, know nothing of the resurrection of Christ, know nothing of the doctrine of justification by faith alone. How can anybody read that simply by watching your life? Your godly example may provoke somebody's interest and say, why do you live the way that you live? It may be the occasion for you to explain the gospel to them, but the bare, naked example itself will not communicate the gospel to people. And sometimes we use that as an excuse for remaining silent and not proclaiming the gospel to people. We say, well, I'm not going to push my views on them verbally. I'll wait until they respond to my stellar example. The other weakness to this argument is few of us are so far along in our sanctification that the world is beating a path to our door, knocking on our door saying, what is it that makes you so special? What do you have that I don't have? And tell me how I can get it. In fact, the closer scrutiny they give to us, they wonder whether we believe the gospel at all. But it goes on to say, a full and faithful witness to Christ includes, for example, the witness of personal testimony, the witness of godly living, acts of mercy and charity to our neighbor, without which the preaching of the gospel appears barren. Now, obviously, if I show no concern for the basic daily needs of my neighbors, and all I do is preach to them about Jesus, my preaching will sound and seem barren to them. Remember, it is through the preaching that God has chosen to save the world, and it is the gospel that God uses as His power to bring people to Christ. And God may even use that proclamation despite my one-dimensional character of it. But at the same time, we are warned in the New Testament by James, for example, when James writes to his people, when he says in chapter 2 of his epistle, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? In the midst of that critical discussion in the second chapter of James, he says this, if a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food. And one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body. What does it profit? You see, what kind of witness is that if we just say to people, be warm and be filled? That is a barren witness, and that's the biblical text that underlies the sentiment that is expressed here in article number 18. Now, when we get to the denial, we read this: we deny that the witness of personal testimony, godly living, and acts of mercy and charity to our neighbors constitute evangelism apart from the proclamation of the gospel. Well, I think most of us can see how our bare example of living is not evangelism. And I think that some of us can see that the very meeting of people's worldly needs in terms of food and clothing and relief and employment and those acts of charity and mercy that the church is to be engaged in. We could be giving away food and shelter and clothes till kingdom come, and a person still not know the gospel. They may be responding saying, hey, these people care about me, and they're giving evidence of that, and they demonstrate the love of God for me. But again, there's no content of the gospel that is communicated by handing somebody a loaf of bread. We are to give them the loaf of bread. We are to give them the cup of cold water. But in that cup of cold water, there is no information about the person and work of Christ. They still don't know the gospel. But what about the other kind of witnessing that is specifically mentioned here, and that is the giving of a personal testimony? The use of personal testimonies is a very highly favored and popular version of outreach in the evangelical church, where people stand up in church on Sunday morning, or they speak privately to their friends, or even to strangers on an airplane or whatever, and they give their personal testimony, and the personal testimony being what has happened to them as a result of having become a Christian. Now, I think that that is a very important element of our communication of the things of God to people. And there's great value to personal testimonies. But we have to remember that the personal testimony is not the gospel. God has not promised that our personal testimonies will not return to Him void. God has not chosen the power of our personal testimony as the means by which He will save the world. Because what my personal testimony does is indirectly talks about Christ, but specifically talks about me and my particular situation. And it may or may not relate to where the person is that I'm communicating with. But the gospel relates to everybody. The gospel has objective, compelling truth contained within it. And that's what we are proclaimed to teach. Again, the testimony may be a lead-in for that, but let's not deceive ourselves into thinking that because we've given a personal testimony, that therefore we've, quote, shared the gospel with somebody. Because the gospel has a definite content that people need to hear and need to understand. I think, for example, the New Testament of the man born blind that Jesus healed. And when He healed him, the Pharisees got all upset at the claim of His healings, and they investigated the man's family, and the man's family verified that Jesus had indeed restored the blind man's sight. And so they came and interrogated the blind man again and say, well, did this man really give you back your sight? How did he do it? Well, he did it by mixing some clay and some spittle and put it on my eyes. And when was that? It was on the Sabbath day. Well, then he was working on the Sabbath day. This man's an evildoer. He can't be an agent of God. What do you think he is? And he said, well, I think he's a prophet. Well, they pushed the interrogation further with him, and finally he says, out of frustration, presumably, hey, all I know is that once I was blind, and now I see. You guys figure it out. You know, He wasn't a theologian. He himself did not yet know the full content of the gospel. All he knew is what Jesus had done for him. And that's valuable, because even if we don't have a grip on the full content of the gospel, we can become a witness for Christ the day that we're converted by sharing with other people what Christ has done in our lives. But again, we must never let the personal testimony become a substitute for the proclamation of the gospel itself. Again, the denial. We deny that the witness of personal testimony, godly living, acts of mercy and charity to our neighbors constitute evangelism apart from the proclamation of the gospel. At the conclusion of this celebration of evangelism, which is interdenominational, there is a statement of commitment that is attached to the end of the document that reads as follows. As evangelicals united in the gospel, we promise to watch over and care for one another, to pray for and forgive one another, and to reach out in love and truth to God's people everywhere, for we are one family, one in the Holy Spirit, and one in Christ. Centuries ago, it was truly said that in things necessary there must be unity, in things less than necessary there must be liberty, and in all things there must be charity. We see all of these gospel truths as necessary. Now, the point of this concluding commitment is this, that though there is a wide diversity of faiths represented here and denominations and those that are involved in this document, and though there is a clear recognition that there are all kinds of theological issues that still divide us at this point and at that point. But what the document is focusing on is that which has been the glue and cement of evangelical unity since the Reformation, the gospel itself. This is the necessary point by which Christians can come together in fellowship.
For more information about Legonier Ministries, call 1-800-435-4343 or contact us on the web at legonier.org. That's LIGONIER.org. Or write P.O. Box 54, 7500, Orlando, Florida, 32854.